Winter had laid its glittering hand over the countryside of West Ledcombe, a tiny village tucked between rolling hills and ancient oak woods. Snowfall had begun the previous evening, and by morning the world looked as though it had been dusted with icing sugar, soft, immaculate, and deceptively peaceful. Smoke curled from cottage chimneys, lamps flickered behind frosted windows, and the narrow high street was so still one could hear the crunch of each footstep like a whisper against the cold. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her thickest wool coat and a scarf she had knitted herself years ago, stepped carefully across the lane. She had come to visit her old friend, Mrs. Adelaide Forsyth, who lived in a charming but draughty house on the edge of the village. The snow made the walk slower, but Miss Marple rather enjoyed the crispness of the air and the invigorating bite of winter. It reminded her of childhood holidays in the Lake District, where sleigh rides and snowdrifts created adventures waiting to happen. But this morning West Ledcombe hummed with unusual conversation. As Miss Marple approached the village post office, a tiny wooden building smelling of ink, twine, and peppermint, she noticed a small gathering. Villagers huddled by the entrance, whispering anxiously with red noses and puffed breath. Among them stood the postmaster, Mr. Rowland Thatch, a round-faced man with spectacles so fogged that he kept polishing them with his sleeve. "Good morning, Mr. Thatch," Miss Marple said, stepping forward with a gentle smile. "You all look rather troubled. Has something dreadful occurred?" Mr. Thatch blinked at her, visibly startled. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, quite dreadful indeed. I dare say we've never had a morning like this." Before he could explain, a tall, stern woman pushed through the small crowd. This was Mrs. Clara Redford, the widowed owner of Redford Farm, known for her commanding presence and her rather sharp viewpoints on how things ought to be done. "It's the Frost coach," she announced, voice clipped. "Came in just past 8. Horses nearly frozen, driver in a state, and one passenger, well, quite dead." A ripple of gasps spread through the crowd. Miss Marple's eyes softened with concern. "Dead," she repeated quietly. "How very tragic. Do we know the circumstances?" "No," Mrs. Redford replied. "But the poor man was slumped over when they opened the coach door. Looked as though he'd fallen asleep and never woken." Miss Marple did not speak right away. She had seen too much of life to accept such a simple explanation so quickly. People seldom died suddenly on an otherwise peaceful mail run, especially inside a horse-drawn coach known for its reliable, if old-fashioned, service. Her blue eyes observed every detail, the anxious expressions, the uncharacteristic agitation of the horses tethered outside, and Mr. Thatch shifting from foot to foot like a kettle on the boil. "Where is the passenger now?" she asked. "In the stable behind the post office," Mr. Thatch replied nervously. "The doctor's been sent for, but the driver, poor Samuel Briggs, is shaken beyond measure." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "May I speak with him?" They led her inside the post office, where the warmth struck her cheeks pleasantly. In a small back room sat Samuel Briggs, a wiry man in his 50s with weather-beaten skin and frozen tears on his lashes. His hands trembled around a cup of steaming tea. "Samuel," Miss Marple said kindly, "I'm terribly sorry for your ordeal. If it isn't too distressing, might you tell us what happened on the road?" The driver swallowed hard. "I've been running that route for 23 years, ma'am. Never seen anything like it. The snow was heavy, but the horses know the way. I had one passenger this morning, Mr. Leonard Wycombe from Wycombe Hall. He boarded at Ledcombe Cross." Miss Marple recognized the name. Leonard Wycombe was a wealthy, reclusive businessman with a reputation for being both brilliant and unbearably arrogant. Few in the village liked him, though many envied his fortune. Samuel continued. "He seemed fine when he climbed aboard. a bit pale perhaps, and muttered something about important papers, but halfway through the journey I heard a strange thud. I called back to ask if he was all right. No answer. When we arrived here he was slumped forward, stiff as a board. Mrs. Redford folded her arms. Heart attack, has to be. Miss Marple tilted her head. Perhaps, but tell me, Samuel, were the windows open? Was it unusually cold inside the coach? Samuel frowned and shook his head. No, ma'am, doors shut tight, no draughts. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her handbag. A coach enclosed against the cold, a man dead without struggle, and that curious remark about important papers. It pricked her instincts sharply. "And did anyone else approach the coach during your loading at the crossroad?" she asked. Samuel hesitated. "Well, now that you mention it, I did see someone standing near the hedgerow. Couldn't make out who, but when I turned to look again, they were gone." Miss Marple exchanged a thoughtful glance with Mr. Thatch. Outside, the murmuring of villagers began again, snowflakes drifting lazily past the windows as though time itself had slowed. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but she would not voice her suspicions yet, not until she saw the body herself. By mid-afternoon, the snow had deepened into thick, silent folds that blanketed every hedge and rooftop. The village of West Ledcombe lay still beneath a grey sky, and yet the air inside the post office stables was thick with tension. Miss Marple, accompanied by Mr. Thatch and Dr. Lionel Harcourt, stood beside the body of Leonard Wycombe, laid carefully upon a blanket near the hay bales. The man's face was unnaturally pale, his lips tinged blue, his eyes were closed, giving the impression of sleep. But Miss Marple, who had attended more funerals than most detectives had solved cases, noticed a curious stillness about him. Not the repose of natural death, but the rigid finality of something darker. Dr. Harcourt, a thin, elderly physician with a perpetually flustered air, straightened his spectacles and cleared his throat. "Well, Miss Marple, he began. "It appears Mr. Wycombe died quite suddenly. No sign of struggle, no bruise or blow. I'd say his heart simply gave out." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "though it is curious, is it not, that his heart should give out on such a short and uneventful journey?" The doctor hesitated, uncomfortable. Stress, maybe, or shock. These business men too much pressure. She smiled faintly. "Indeed, doctor, though one might expect a letter of resignation before death, not after." Mr. Thatch coughed politely, half amused, half nervous. Miss Marple bent closer to the body, her eyes tracing the edges of Wycombe's collar. Something caught her attention, a faint white residue clinging to the fabric. She dabbed it lightly with her gloved finger and frowned. Powder, it glistened faintly in the lamplight, like frost, but too fine, too deliberate. "Doctor," she said quietly, "might I trouble you to examine this powder near the collar? It doesn't appear to be snow." "Doctor." Harcourt peered closer and frowned. Curious indeed. Not salt, not frost. Possibly residue from something ingested. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps something he drank on the journey. They found a small silver flask beside the seat in the coach, engraved with Wycombe's initials. Inside, a pungent odour lingered. The doctor sniffed it and frowned. Brandy, but with a bitter note, not right. Miss Marple's expression softened with sadness. "I see. Then it seems Mr. Wycombe's heart did not give out of its own accord." Word of the discovery spread quickly, as it always did in English villages where gossip travelled faster than telegrams. By evening, the local constable, Inspector Howard Crayer, arrived from the neighbouring town. A solid man with a practical mind and little patience for intuition, he greeted Miss Marple with polite tolerance. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat. I hear you've already started your sleuthing." "Oh no, Inspector," she replied, eyes twinkling. "I merely listen and observe. Things have a way of speaking if one allows them." Cray chuckled. "Very well, then, let's hear what the village has to say." By the next morning, Miss Marple had begun her quiet round of conversations. She knew that in such cases the truth hid not in grand declarations, but in small inconsistencies. Her first visit was to Mrs. Clara Redford, the farmer's widow. Mrs. Redford poured tea in her immaculate kitchen, a place where every spoon gleamed and every shelf smelled faintly of polish. "Poor Mr. Wycombe," she said briskly, "though I can't say I'm surprised. He made enemies faster than tea cools, threatened to foreclose on the baker's cottage, you know." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, stirring her tea absently. "And you yourself, Mrs. Redford, you had dealings with him, did you not?" The woman stiffened. "A small matter about the south field, nothing important." But Miss Marple caught the flicker of discomfort in her eyes. "Of course," she said kindly, "you must miss your husband terribly this time of year." That subtle shift of subject loosened Mrs. Redford's guard. She sighed, setting her cup down. "It's been 3 winters now, hard ones. Mr. Wycombe knew it. He enjoyed pressing his advantage." Miss Marple filed it away gently. Another motive, though perhaps not the most urgent one. Next, she called upon Reverend Paul Danvers, the mild-mannered vicar whose church Mr. Wycombe had recently donated a rather ostentatious stained glass window. He seemed uneasy, fidgeting with his spectacles. "I can't believe he's gone," he said. "He was difficult, yes, but generous, at least outwardly." "Outwardly?" Miss Marple prompted softly. The vicar sighed. "He used his generosity as leverage. Last month he demanded the parish support his nomination for magistrate. When I declined, he withdrew all funding. A man who purchases virtue," Miss Marple said mildly. "A risky investment." The vicar smiled sadly. "You have the gift of understatement, Miss Marple." By late afternoon, Miss Marple stopped at the Wycombe Hall, where the deceased's young housekeeper, Evelyn Drake, received her nervously. The girl could not have been more than 25, with pale hands and eyes that darted like frightened birds. "I didn't do anything wrong, Miss Marple," she said quickly. "I only packed his case and filled his flask, same as always." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But tell me, did anyone else handle the flask before he left?" Evelyn hesitated. "Mr. Wycombe told me to leave it on his study desk. He said someone was calling for it later. When I returned, it was gone, but when he came down for the journey, it was back in its place." Miss Marple's expression barely changed, though her mind sharpened like a blade. "And did he mention who might have taken it?" "No, ma'am, only that it was a matter of private business." That night, Miss Marple sat beside the fire at Mrs. Forsyth's cottage, knitting quietly while the flames hissed and cracked. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, endlessly, burying the roads and hedgerows in silence. To most, West Ledcombe seemed peaceful again. But Miss Marple knew better. Somewhere among its handful of polite, respectable citizens lay the hand that had poured death into a silver flask, and she meant to find it. The next morning dawned pale and brittle, the sunlight cold as glass over the fields of West Ledcombe. Snow lay deep upon the hedgerows, and the silence that hung over the village felt heavy, like a held breath waiting for release. Miss Marple rose early, her mind already stirring with quiet precision. The matter of the silver flask preoccupied her. Who, she wondered, had tampered with it during those few unguarded hours? And why had Mr. Wycombe insisted on taking the Frost coach that morning instead of his motor car, as he usually did? By 8:30, the village was abuzz once more. Inspector Cray had returned, tramping through the snow in his heavy boots, looking slightly out of place among the tidy cottages. He found Miss Marple seated near the fire in the post office parlour, knitting serenely as though murder were merely another item on her morning agenda. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, removing his gloves. "I've spoken to the driver again. No sign of forced entry, no footprints near the coach at the crossroads except his own and the horse's." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "That would suggest, Inspector, that the deed was prepared before the journey began." "Poison, you mean?" "Something of that sort, yes," she replied. "Mr. Wickham drank from his flask only once the coach had started. A simple act, one that might have seemed perfectly ordinary, but if someone anticipated that habit." Inspector Cray frowned. "Then we're looking at someone close to him, someone with access to his belongings." "Precisely," she said, smiling faintly, "and as I understand, that list is quite short." By noon, Miss Marple paid another call to Wickham Hall. The grand house stood bleak and quiet, its tall windows rimmed with frost. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Evelyn Drake, the housekeeper, answered the door at once, her eyes red from sleeplessness. "Have you had any visitors since the inspector came?" Miss Marple asked gently. Evelyn shook her head. "Only Mr. Basil Trent, the solicitor. He came to collect some of Mr. Wickham's documents." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple murmured, stepping inside. "Mr. Trent, the same gentleman who manages several estates in the area, I believe." "That's right. He's been with Mr. Wickham for years." Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a faint trace of cologne in the hallway and a wet footprint leading away from the study door. Someone had stood there only recently. She approached the desk and noticed an open drawer. Within it lay several sealed envelopes, one of them marked codicil. She turned to Evelyn. "Do you know what this refers to?" Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Mr. Wickham had me type it last week. He said it was an update to his will, leaving a sum of money to Mrs. Redford for her late husband's debts. He made me promise not to mention it." Miss Marple's needles paused in midair. How very generous of him, and how very inconvenient that he should die before it was signed. Later that afternoon, the snow began to thaw slightly, dripping from eaves and turning the lanes to slush. Miss Marple stopped by the vicarage again, where Reverend Danvers greeted her with visible relief. "Ah, Miss Marple, you've heard about the codicil, I presume." Her eyes twinkled. "So it's not as secret as Mr. Wickham imagined." The vicar smiled weakly. "Nothing remains secret in West Ledcombe for long. Poor Mrs. Redford, imagine her debts forgiven, but now it seems that kindness will never reach her. Unless," Miss Marple said quietly, "someone wished precisely that to happen." The vicar blinked. "You mean that the will was motive for murder?" Miss Marple nodded gently. "Money is a vulgar but persistent reason for crime, my dear Reverend, especially when one's livelihood or reputation depends upon it." By evening the pieces of gossip had knitted themselves into a patter, threads of resentment, opportunity, and fear, yet something still eluded her. She sat by Mrs. Forsyth's fire, staring thoughtfully into the flames. "Adelaide," she said suddenly, "you knew Leonard Wickham slightly, didn't you?" Mrs. Forsyth looked up from her embroidery. "Barely, though I recall he once came to our charity luncheon, seemed rather taken with Evelyn Drake." Poor girl blushed scarlet. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Really? That's most interesting." "Oh, it was nothing improper," Mrs. Forsyth added quickly, but she was quite flustered. "He was a difficult man, but one could tell. He liked to control those around him." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, that may have been the key to his undoing." The next morning, Inspector Cray arrived once again, this time with news. Lab report came back. He said, handing Miss Marple a paper, "Traces of digitalis in the flask. Strong dose." Miss Marple read quietly. "Digitalis, from the foxglove plant, easily found in cottage gardens if one knows how to use it." Cray frowned. and deadly in the wrong hands. Indeed, she murmured, and I dare say the wrong hands are rather close at hand. She stood and reached for her coat. Inspector, I believe it's time we speak again with Mrs. Redford, and with Mr. Trent, the solicitor. You see, I believe both had reason to see Mr. Wycombe silenced, but only one had the opportunity. They found Mrs. Redford at the village inn, sipping tea by the fire. She looked composed, almost serene. When Miss Marple mentioned the codicil, a faint flicker of shock crossed her face. I knew nothing of that, she said quickly. Why would he leave me anything? Miss Marple regarded her steadily. Because your late husband owed him a debt. But if that codicil had been signed, your land would have been freed from his claim. His death, however, keeps it in his estate, and under the solicitor's control. Mrs. Redford blinked. You mean Mr. Trent? Precisely. He benefits by keeping matters as they are. The widow's face hardened. Then you think it was Trent? Miss Marple smiled mildly. I think it is time to let people speak for themselves, Mrs. Redford. As the snow thickened outside once more, Miss Marple's mind settled into its final calm. The clues were aligned: a tampered flask, a hidden codicil, and a solicitor with far too much to lose. Yet one question remained unanswered. How exactly had he gained access to Wycombe's study undetected? That, she promised herself, she would discover by tomorrow morning, for in West Ledcombe even the snow could not conceal guilt forever. The following day brought a stillness to West Ledcombe so deep that even the birds seemed to hush. The snow had stopped at last, leaving the landscape silvered and silent. It was a deceptive calm, for beneath it, tension had begun to simmer among the villagers. The talk in every sitting room, over every teacup, revolved around a single question: who had poisoned Leonard Wycombe? Miss Marple, however, did not engage in speculation. She had spent the morning walking thoughtfully through the snow-covered lanes, her neat boots leaving a trail of delicate impressions. Her destination was Wycombe Hall, and she carried with her that faint smile which, to those who knew her well, always meant she had reached a conclusion. Inspector Cray arrived soon after, summoned at her request. He met her at the grand oak doors, his expression sceptical but curious. You said you've discovered something, Miss Marple. Yes, Inspector, she replied serenely, something quite important. It is time, I think, that all concerned hear it. Within a few minutes, the hall's drawing-room filled with uneasy faces. Mrs. Clara Redford, seated stiffly near the hearth, her gloved hands folded. Evelyn Drake, pale and anxious, twisting a handkerchief. Reverend Danvers, keen, dyed but tense, and lastly Mr. Basil Trent, the solicitor, who looked politely amused, as though all this were a rather unnecessary fuss. Miss Marple stood near the window, framed by pale light, and regarded them each in turn. "I have asked you here," she began, because Mr. Wycombe's death, though seemingly natural, was not so. He was poisoned with digitalis, a preparation most often derived from the foxglove plant, common in our gardens, deadly when misused. I believe that poison was introduced into Mr. Wycombe's flask before his journey on Frost coach. There was a murmur of alarm. Mr. Trent cleared his throat. "You're implying murder, Miss Marple. Surely we should await official confirmation before making accusations." Miss Marple's smile remained gentle. "The confirmation has already come, Mr. Trent. The laboratory has found traces of digitalis in the brandy. What remains is the question of who placed it there, and why." She turned slightly toward the fire. "I have considered each of you. Mrs. Redford had reason to despise Mr. Wycombe, for he held her late husband's debts over her. The Reverend opposed him in parish affairs, and Miss Drake served in his household with easy access to his possessions. Yet none of you, I think, would have had both knowledge and the daring to commit such a crime so neatly. Mr. Trent gave a polite chuckle. "And whom do you propose did?" Miss Marple's eyes met his calmly. "You, Mr. Trent." The words landed like a dropped glass. Evelyn gasped softly, while the Reverend looked aghast. Mr. Trent straightened, still composed. "My dear lady, that's absurd. I was his solicitor, not his assassin." Miss Marple nodded mildly. "Indeed, and yet your motives were of the most practical kind. You managed Mr. Wycombe's estates, profiting handsomely from his rather questionable business arrangements. The new codicil, had it been signed, would have released Mrs. Redford's farm and several other properties from his control, thereby diminishing your influence and income." Trent's expression hardened slightly. "Speculation, Miss Marple." "Oh, but there is more than speculation," she said. "You see, you were in the habit of collecting Mr. Wycombe's correspondence. You had a duplicate key to his study drawer, one which, curiously, you failed to mention to the inspector. You visited the hall the evening before the Frost coach's departure, under the pretext of having papers signed. That was when you found the flask upon his desk, left there by Miss Drake. You poured away the brandy, replaced it with a dose already prepared, digitalis dissolved in spirits, and left, confident that the snowstorm would delay discovery, and so it did." Mrs. Redford's eyes widened. "Good heavens!" Evelyn covered her mouth with trembling hands. I remember, I heard someone in the study that evening, just after I went to fetch coal. I thought it was Mr. Wycombe himself." Inspector Cray looked sharply at Trent. "Is this true? Did you visit the hall that night?" The solicitor's face flushed. "Yes, briefly, but only to leave some papers." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, papers, and something rather more lethal." She turned to the inspector. "You may also wish to examine his coat pocket. Mr. Trent has been most careful, but I dare say he overlooked a small glass vial, a habit of the cautious poisoner. Always keep a second measure in case the first fails." Trent's composure broke. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You've no proof." "None." Miss Marple said quietly, "But we have the evidence of method. Mr. Wycombe's signature was missing from that codicil, though it was witnessed by the vicar only yesterday morning. That means the document was removed after the vicar left, and before Mr. Wycombe boarded the coach. Who but you, Mr. Trent, had both access and motive to ensure it was never valid." The silence that followed was thick and dreadful. Snowlight flickered on the walls. Inspector Cray stepped forward, his expression grim. "Mr. Basil Trent, I must ask you to accompany me to the station. We'll sort this properly." Trent's shoulders sagged. For a moment his arrogance slipped, replaced by weary resignation. "It wasn't supposed to happen so soon," he muttered. "Just enough to make him ill, enough to delay the signing. Curse the cold. He must have taken more than I thought." Miss Marple lowered her eyes. "Poison is a treacherous weapon, Mr. Trent. It rarely stops where one intends." As he was led away, the room exhaled a long, silent breath. Evelyn wept quietly. Mrs. Redford sat pale and shaken. The Reverend, after a moment, said softly, "You saw it all before anyone else did." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, not all, Reverend. Only enough to know that human nature, even under snow, leaves its footprints." The storm had passed. By the next morning, West Ledcombe woke beneath a clear sky, the snow gleaming like diamonds scattered over the countryside. The Frost coach stood empty in the post yard, its wheels half buried, its horses resting quietly. Life, it seemed, was returning to its ordinary rhythm, but the village would not soon forget the shadow that had passed over it. At Mrs. Forsyth's cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, knitting in her usual serene manner while the kettle sang on the hob. She had already written a short letter to her nephew Raymond, recounting the curious events of the past week with her customary modesty. "It is, perhaps, rather astonishing," she wrote, How greed wears the face of respectability so convincingly, one might almost say that the more polished the manner, the more practiced the deceit. The door opened, and Inspector Cray entered, brushing the snow from his hat. He looked tired but satisfied. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Thought you'd like to know. It's all been settled. Mr. Trent's confessed in full. The codicil, the poison, everything." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I expected as much. A guilty conscience, Inspector, is far less durable than one imagines." Cray nodded. "He said he didn't mean to kill Wickham, only delay him from signing, but once the dose was poured, there was no turning back. Foolish business, that. Smart man. Ruined himself over greed." Miss Marple laid down her knitting. "Intelligence, dear Inspector, is no protection against folly. The cleverest people often commit the most foolish crimes, precisely because they think themselves clever enough to get away with them." He chuckled softly. "Quite right, Miss Marple. Still, I must say you saw through it quicker than we did. How did you know it was Trent?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "It was the smallest things, really. A footprint where no servant would tread. The faint scent of tobacco in the study. Trent smokes a particular Turkish blend. And of course, Evelyn's recollection of hearing someone in the room that night. Mr. Wycomb's business often took him late, but he was never careless enough to leave his drawer unlocked. That meant someone with a key. And who else but his solicitor?" Cray grinned ruefully. "You make it sound so simple." "Oh, it usually is, once one observes the right details. Life has a way of presenting truth in miniature, tiny, domestic truths that mirror greater ones. Men are always poisoning one another, Inspector, if not with foxglove, then with pride or jealousy or greed." Later that day, Miss Marple took her customary walk through the village. Children were building snowmen near the green. Mrs. Redford passed by, stopping to thank her earnestly. "Miss Marple," she said, "I can't tell you what this means to me. To think I nearly lost my land entirely. Had Mr. Trent succeeded." Miss Marple patted her arm kindly. "The Almighty works through the oddest agents, my dear, sometimes even an inquisitive old woman." Mrs. Redford smiled through tears. "They'll sign the codicil now, won't they, even after his death?" "Oh, I believe so," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Wycomb's intentions were quite clear. The law, fortunately, can be persuaded to honour justice when guided by truth." As Mrs. Redford walked on, Miss Marple turned toward the church. Reverend Danvers was standing near the gate, speaking softly with Evelyn Drake. The poor girl looked pale still, but calmer, relieved to be freed from suspicion. When the vicar saw Miss Marple, he raised his hat. "All's right again, thanks to you." "Not to me, Reverend," she said gently. "To honesty. It always finds its way to the surface, however deep men try to bury it." He smiled. "Perhaps that's why I like the snow. It covers everything, but never for long." That evening, as dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple sat by the hearth once more. The fire crackled, the air smelled faintly of pine, and Mrs. Forsyth dozed comfortably in her chair. From the mantelpiece, the brass clock ticked softly, steady as a heartbeat. Miss Marple looked into the flames, her mind reflective. She thought of Leonard Wickham not kindly, but not uncharitably either. A man of ambition and vanity, brought low by another's ambition and vanity. Such was human nature, ever predictable, ever surprising. She thought of Basil Trent, whose polished manners had deceived nearly everyone. She had known men like him before, those who mistake control for virtue and calculation for wisdom. But most of all, she thought of the frost coach itself, that humble relic of another time. How fitting that a murder so coldly planned should unfold within it, on a journey through snow and silence. There was something poetic in that, if one had a mind to see it. Mrs. Forsyth stirred and smiled sleepily. "You're very quiet tonight, Jane, thinking about your next puzzle. Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Oh, I dare say there will always be another. Villages are quite as full of mysteries as cities, only smaller, tidier, and rather better behaved." Mrs. Forsyth laughed. "And what will you call this one when you tell Raymond?" Miss Marple's knitting resumed, her needles clicking gently. "I think," she said, "I shall call it The Chilling Murder on the Frost Coach. Quite descriptive, don't you think?" Mrs. Forsyth smiled, drifting back into drowsy silence. Outside, the frost returned, delicate and glistening under the moonlight. The world was peaceful once again, on the surface at least, and in her quiet heart Miss Marple knew that peace in a village, like snow upon the fields, always concealed a few secrets waiting to thaw.